Hey folks, David Stewart here. Hope you guys are having a fantastic day. Let's talk about Final Fantasy V, which I had the pleasure of playing on stream for a protracted number of weeks. It took me a little bit longer to get through it than previous Final Fantasy games because I really wasn't playing it off stream during most of those times when I was playing the previous games off stream quite a bit more. That being said, Final Fantasy V is a fun game, and this is going to be my analysis and review of it. Before I get into the nitty-gritty details of my play experience with the game, I want to briefly cover all the different versions of Final Fantasy V, because if you are looking to play this game, you may want to make some decisions about which version of the game you would like to play. So first of all, this game never came out in English back when it was current in the early 1990s. So if you speak Japanese, you can of course play the original Super Famicom version. If you don't speak Japanese, that's when you're going to have to make some decisions. If you want to play the Super Famicom original in English, there are some fan translations out there, but in order to play it, you will need to download a ROM, which has some, let's say, legal gray issues involved with it, and either put it on an Evercart to play on original hardware or play it with an emulator. I chose to play the PlayStation 1 version of the game, which you can get as part of the Final Fantasy Anthology, released in 1999 for the original PlayStation, or you can buy the individual game off the PlayStation Store as one of the PS1 classics on the PS3 or the PS Vita. I did my playthrough on the PS Vita because if you are playing through Adrenaline on a hacked Vita, you have a lot of options for CRT filters, and it really makes the game look and feel more like what it looked like back in the early 90s playing on a CRT TV. That version of the game does have a couple of issues. Notably, it is missing one or two music tracks. There are loading screens every time you go into or out of battle, which will affect you if you are playing it on the original disc in an original PlayStation system. If you're playing it as a digital version of the game, a PS1 classic on the PS Vita as I played it, it's not that much of an issue, but it does slow the game down a little bit compared to actually playing it off a cartridge. And of course, it has a unique translation that is different from other translations. And in that one, I think Ferris, it has a little bit of a pirate accent, which is missing from other versions of this particular game. But the aesthetic sense of the game is maintained. The graphics are essentially the same as the Super Famicom version, and that's what I really wanted out of my playthrough. There's also the Game Boy Advance release, which I think serves as the backbone of later releases as far as gameplay goes. I couldn't get any Game Boy Advance version to work with my emulators, and that was a little bit of a problem, so I had to go with the PlayStation 1 version. But the Game Boy Advance version looks pretty good. It has good, colorful graphics. Some things are redrawn. The backgrounds are scaled up. But it does more or less maintain the original aesthetic sense of the Super Famicom game. So that is also a good option. Be aware that it does run at a lower resolution, so things are a little bit sized down as far as the number of pixels making up some of the sprites compared to the Super Famicom and the PlayStation. That version, and I believe the following versions, also have additional dungeons and some additional jobs that you can unlock and play around with, so that's a fun bonus to the Game Boy version. There's also the mobile version, which I own through Steam. I really do not recommend this version for several reasons. Well, you can't get it on Steam anymore, but on the Steam version, it would crash constantly, so I couldn't even play the game to capture a lot of footage. I think it runs better on the mobile platforms, but it completely loses its aesthetic sense compared to the original Super Famicom game. All of the sprites are redrawn, they're larger, there's more colors and a gradient effect that occurs on lots of the sprites, and frankly, I'm not a fan of the new redrawn sprites. I don't think they look very good. You do, however, get splash screens that include Yoshitaka Amano's concept art, which I think is nice to look at in-game. And I think some of those are included in the Pixel Remaster, which is the last one that I'll mention. I don't own this one. It hadn't come out when I started playing this game. in 2021 on stream, and now I'm doing this review in early 2022, way after the fact. So I didn't have a chance to buy this one and play through it. It seems to be pretty good. It more or less maintains the aesthetic sense of the original, but the backgrounds are way scaled up. They're much higher detailed. There's many more colors on the sprites and in the backgrounds themselves. So it's something maybe more akin to the PSP remakes of Final Fantasy IV in terms of the overall aesthetic direction. All of the sprites contain this odd black outline around them, which I don't really like, and I think is a little bit jarring. Although you do get to turn on a CRT filter with these games, I believe, if you play them on PC, which will give it more of the aesthetic sense of the original. So that's probably the version that most people are going to look to buying. It's the most accessible. It's an official release from Square, not a fan translation. So you're going to get a script that Squaresoft at least thinks is appropriate for the English audience. You're going to more or less get the aesthetic sense of the original Super Famicom release, and you're going to get a CRT filter and the bells and whistles that come with playing a game which is designed to run on modern hardware. I'm not a big fan of the fonts used in the menu, but that's kind of a little bit nitpicky. That's probably the version most people are going to look to play. It's a little bit easier to get a hold of than the version I played, which is the PlayStation 1 version, which is the other version I would recommend if you're wanting to play this, say, on the PS Vita or the PS3. I think that's a really good option. With that out of the way, let's jump into the analysis portion of the version I played, which was the PS1 version played on the PS Vita using Adrenaline. That means it's going to be on a hacked Vita, just a little FYI. So first of all, let's talk about gameplay. There's 3 different levels of gameplay, and all of them, I think, have interesting elements to them. So the micro element is the classic ATB turn-based battle system that you're familiar with Final Fantasy 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on, all the way until it gets replaced by a more modern system in Final Fantasy 12, not counting Final Fantasy 11, which is an MMO. That battle system works very well. It's what you're familiar with. The strategic elements are the same as they are in the other games. You have to decide which monsters to attack when to use magic, what kind of magic to use, the basic strategy that occurs in a turn-based battle system. If you like it, then you're probably going to like Final Fantasy V's battle system. Next is the macro level, which is going to be leveling your characters, acquiring equipment for them, exploring dungeons, and exploring the world. This level of the game is generally pretty interesting, although I will say that there was very wide stretches of traversing the world in between actual story beats and between actual dungeons. The dungeons generally are pretty good. The exploration doesn't feel like it punishes you for making certain decisions, which has been the case in a couple of Final Fantasy games in the past. Some places have some very non-obvious progression to them. Like there was one spot where you walk into this area of a level, and I spent a long time trying to find hidden doors because I couldn't get through that screen. When I left the room to go check another room, well, it triggered a cutscene, and that cutscene unlocked the way forward in that room. So there's a bunch of little places in this game where there's non-obvious progression through a level or to a level that doesn't unlock unless you fulfill certain little requirements to unlock a cutscene. That was a little bit annoying. In a couple places, I had to look things up online because I didn't remember or didn't know where I was supposed to go next, and it really was not obvious with the version of game that I was playing. So that's a little bit of a downside. Like previous titles, there are multiple worlds to explore. In this case, there are 3, and the maps overlay with each other in a pretty interesting way. Now, the thing about those 3 worlds with this game is that those 3 worlds are mostly wilderness. They're mostly empty between certain spots. And by the time you get to the 3rd world, that's when I think the world really opens up and gets pretty interesting. But overall, I liked the exploration of those different areas, using airships, walking and using chocobos and finding different ways to get to different places. Generally, I thought it was pretty good. The highest mode of gameplay, the meta level, is where I think this game really shines, and this is where most people are going to say they really enjoy the gameplay systems of Final Fantasy V, and that is the job systems. The job systems, not just in themselves, like choosing, I want this character to be a ninja, I want this character to be a white mage or a monk, whatever it is. Not just that, but also mastering the skills from each class so that you can create combinations of skills, rapid fire with a dual wielding ninja and things like that. Not just that, but collecting these mastery skills as you play through each job and go through the game so that when you get to the end of the game, you can turn your characters back into a freelancer or turn them into mimes to make extremely powerful characters. There's just something so fun about building up your characters and having them learn and master new job skills to make them just uber powerful. And by the time I got to the last boss of this game, I had, I think, 3 mimes and a freelancer, and I could spam the last boss so hard that there was no way I was going to lose to the last boss. I say that I think I actually died once and had to do it again, but the last boss, the tree version of Exdeath, was totally easy at that point because I had mastered the job systems. And it may seem like, well, the last boss is easy. Isn't that not very fun or challenging? No, what was fun and fulfilling about it was that you mastered the gameplay systems to create those uber mimes that could just spam the highest level magic or the highest level skills onto a boss over and over again to destroy it very, very quickly. That was a lot of fun for me, and that's where I think a lot of people have fun with this game, is combining those jobs and job skills in different unique ways to produce interesting ways to overcome challenges and master the game. In fact, I think if you don't interact with the meta and think about the job system that way, this game could indeed be perhaps too challenging. But if you know that job system really well, then it's actually quite a bit of fun to encounter those challenges and have to make some uber characters to overcome them. So in general, I give the gameplay an 8 out of 10, and the reason it's not a 9 or a 10 is simply the game starts to drag about halfway through, and you end up really doing a lot of grinding before you get to the end of this game. It's a very long game, kind of like Final Fantasy III. So next, let's talk about production, which is going to include the art and the music. I like the look of this game. It has these small sprites, kind of like NES and kind of like Final Fantasy IV, but boy, do they get a lot of expression out of those sprites by using kind of wild, big eyes and extra lines around the sprites during the little cutscenes. They get a lot of work out of those smaller sprites. I'm a bigger fan of the big sprites on Final Fantasy VI, but the little sprites actually do quite a bit of work in this one. In general, the environments look pretty good. They have a high detailed look to them, and they feel pretty good. It's pretty obvious if you're encountering a door or anything else like that. The backgrounds are fairly simple, but they definitely do the job, and there are lots of good little details in those backgrounds, especially coming from Final Fantasy IV, which had a little bit more simpler backgrounds in general with the original SNES release. The music is another soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu, who does another great job. In general, I like the music. I think there are some acoustic sounding tracks that are some of my favorite of the series. I love the music during some of the cutscenes. What I really got tired of, though, was the battle music and some of the overworld music. So in general, I like the music. I did get a little bit tired of the battle theme. That could be expected because you hear one battle theme and it's a very long game. So in general, I like the music, and I give the overall production an 8 out of 10. We aren't going to see the absolute height of 2D graphics until we get to Final Fantasy VI, but the visuals of Final Fantasy V are certainly serviceable, if not overly pretty compared to some other SNES games. Now, lastly, we can talk a little bit about the story, and if I'm being honest, I think this is the weakest portion of Final Fantasy V is the story. There's a few reasons for this. The first one is that the story tends to really drag. There are very long periods in various places in the game where there's no story beat, where you are doing multiple dungeons without the story progressing. There are multiple times where you're wandering around the world trying to figure out where to go next, and it's easy to lose sight of what the story's doing. And on a technical level, the story relies very heavily on coincidence. You have Galuf, who was one of these original Warriors of the Dawn, and he's come to this world to try to stop Exdeath, as you find out. He just happens to run into Bartz, who just happens to be the son of one of the older Warriors of the Dawn that Galuf happened to know. You have Ferris and Raina, who's actually Lena in some of the other versions of the game. They are long-lost sisters that just happen to meet up, and Ferris, the pirate captain, happens to also be a princess. Now, that creates some interesting story scenes and some cool cutscenes and a lot of comical things, but it's an extreme coincidence by the time we find out about it. One thing I did find very lovable about the story is that the character interactions are a lot of fun. I really enjoyed a lot of the cutscenes. I thought it was really kind of entertaining how you have Ferris essentially dressing as a man and more or less pretending to be a man. And there's some shock when Bart finds out that she's actually a girl. This sort of thing, I don't know if it would even fly in the modern period, but it's presented in a comical way and comes off as generally a pretty lighthearted and fun experience with these various characters. One thing that I did like was one of the characters who is in your party for a very long time ends up sacrificing himself. Now, this is a very old game, so hopefully you guys don't care about spoilers, but Galuf ends up dying in this battle with Exdeath. Now, you've had character deaths and sacrifices before. We had a bunch of them in Final Fantasy IV, but none with a character who had been in the party for dozens of hours of gameplay and story progression, which is what you got with Galuf. And then you have him basically replaced with Kryl, so you don't lose any of your job progression. It kind of, not a big gameplay consequence to losing him, but certainly I think that had a good emotional impact. The villains in this game are somewhat cartoonish. They're really over the top. They're constantly taunting their enemies and explaining their plans. Not my favorite enemies. Exdeath is not my favorite villain. I don't find him particularly intimidating or scary even. And I find his plans just don't seem to make as much sense as villains in other games. So that's another, I guess, weak point of the story. But the main weak point of the story is that it just takes a long time to go through the story, and there's very long pauses between any kind of significant story beats, which means that I just wasn't all that invested in the story. Now, one thing that's interesting about this game is that you get different endings based on who is still alive when you kill the final boss. If a character is dead when the final boss is killed, then that character's kind of dead in the final cutscenes. However, the final cutscenes don't really have a good emotional weight to them compared to some other games. We don't have like Bart's deciding that he's got a love interest or anything like that. It's just a follow-up. Here's the world after they've been successful, and there's some kind of nothing dialogue, and then the credits roll. So the ending, I think, is kind of a miss as well, though I do think the different endings, depending on who is dead or alive at the end, was kind of a nice touch. So overall, I give the story a 6 out of 10. It's okay, it's passable, but it's pretty far from my favorite Final Fantasy story. I do see how a lot of people can say Final Fantasy V is their favorite Final Fantasy game or one of their favorites, though, because of the meta level of the gameplay, which just keeps the gameplay fresh and interesting throughout. Changing different jobs and figuring out what's the most optimum. There's a lot of interesting levels to that, and I think that's what saves the game for me is that high quality of gameplay with the job system. It's probably my second favorite game as far as the job system goes, behind Final Fantasy Tactics, which has a superb job system, but I don't know if I'm going to do that game as part of this series. So that is Final Fantasy V. Overall, a very enjoyable game. I give it about a 7.3 out of 10, which is average, but I think it's really enjoyable, and I think it's worth playing if you enjoy combining those different job systems. I think you'll have fun with it, and if you like turn-based battles, of course. So let me know what you think of Final Fantasy V down below in the comments. Is it one of your favorite Final Fantasy games? Is it one of those ones like for me that's kind of in the middle, or did you not really enjoy it? Hopefully this has been informative as to what you can expect out of the game and what platforms you might want to seek to play the game on. Let me know if you played the Pixel Remaster and if you've had any kinds of issues running that game, or if you have any opinions on that as well, because I'd love to read them, having not actually played that game since it wasn't out when I started my playthrough of Final Fantasy V. So thank you so much. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You can hop on my mailing list at dbspress.com/list, and I will see you all next time.